The following is a true, well-documented case of the supernatural. What you are about to read is not a work of fiction, but a chilling account of real events reported by eyewitnesses, investigators, and historical records. If you believe that the unexplained doesn't exist, then this story might just change your mind. I want to share with you the story of the Snedeker House in Southington, Connecticut, a place that first came to the public's attention in the mid-1980s when a family named the Snedekers rented what seemed like an ordinary home. The truth behind that home, however, proved to be anything but ordinary. Looking back, it's hard to imagine that a simple change of address could set off a series of events so unsettling that even to this day, people debate what really happened within those walls. Yet for the Snedeker family, Alan, Carmen, their children, and a few relatives who joined them, the haunting would become a life-altering experience that forced them to question both their sense of reality and their faith. I first heard whispers about a haunted funeral home when I was younger. Friends would tell rumors about a house in Connecticut where a family moved in only to discover rooms filled with bizarre items left over from an old mortuary business. They spoke of ghostly apparitions, unexplained smells, and violent occurrences that left visitors terrified. Even as a child, the idea of living in a place once used to prepare the dead for burial seemed frightening. But it was not until years later that I learned these stories were about the Snedeker family and their troubling ordeal, which would eventually be investigated by famous paranormal researchers Ed and Lorraine Warren, and later adapted into a Hollywood film called The Haunting in Connecticut. Whether you believe the events that follow or dismiss them as exaggerations, it is difficult to deny the grip that this story continues to hold on anyone who hears it. The Snedekers were drawn to Southington by necessity. One of their children was ill, and they needed a home closer to a medical facility offering specialized treatment. Funds were tight, and so they were relieved to find a rental property large enough to accommodate their family. The house was old but spacious, with multiple rooms and a basement that could be used for storage or a play area. At first, it seemed like a dream come true for a family under stress, a place where they could focus on healing and stability. But shortly after settling in, they began to notice strange little details that set them on edge. The basement, in particular, felt unsettling, and it wasn't long before they discovered items suggesting that this house had once been used as a funeral parlor. Some stories claim that old coffin handles, embalming tools, or even an eerie lift used to transport bodies were found locked away in dusty corners of the basement. Although finding such reminders of a funeral home's past would be unsettling for anyone, the Snedekers tried at first to shrug it off, telling themselves that history is full of oddities. Yet from these small discoveries grew an atmosphere of dread that soon permeated the entire house. It started with minor incidents. Lights would flicker for no apparent reason. Doors that had been firmly shut would appear open moments later. Footsteps seemed to echo in empty rooms, as though someone unseen was pacing, especially late at night when the family was trying to sleep. Carmen would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to the faint sound of whispering, but she could never pinpoint its source. Alan, too, began to feel a sense of watchfulness in the house, as though something was silently observing every move they made. Even the children, who initially were excited about having more room to play, gradually began to express fears they couldn't fully articulate. One of the most unsettling parts of the family's testimony involved disturbing visions experienced by one of their sons. He was already dealing with health issues, which was the reason the family had moved closer to the hospital. According to accounts given later, this child began to see shadowy figures standing in doorways or gliding down the halls. At times, he claimed these figures would appear to be shaped like people from another time, their expressions frozen in grimaces of pain or anger. In the quiet hours, he would wake screaming, insisting that dark men or grotesque faces hovered near his bed, their presence filled with malice. For parents under tremendous stress, trying to keep their son healthy while also managing the demands of daily life, such tales were almost too much to bear. But as the weeks went on, it became harder and harder to dismiss these stories as simple nightmares. Other members of the family began having their own encounters. Carmen reported hearing soft cries or moans coming from the basement, a part of the house she had grown to hate. Alan once said that he felt an invisible hand brush against his arm while he was alone in the living room, just a light touch, almost curious, but terrifying enough to make him recoil. Some nights, a rancid odor like decaying flesh seemed to drift through the house, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. They checked the plumbing, the garbage, even the yard for dead animals, but found no explanation. Worse yet, arguments within the household began to escalate, as if a heavy tension was amplifying every little disagreement. Carmen later described it as feeling like the house itself was feeding on their fear and stress, growing bolder as their anxieties mounted. Word of the family's predicament started to leak out. Neighbors noticed the Snedekers looked exhausted and worried. Some visitors who dropped by claimed they felt uneasy in the home, mentioning cold spots or hearing faint voices. Rumors spread that the old mortuary had left more than just physical items behind, that perhaps restless spirits, or something far worse, lurked in the shadows of that basement. For those inclined to believe in the supernatural, it seemed obvious that the house's dark past as a funeral parlor was directly connected to the odd phenomena. For skeptics, these stories were chalked up to stress, active imaginations, and the eerie power of suggestion. Regardless of which side people took, the Snedekers were at the heart of a growing storm of speculation. In time, the situation escalated from mere oddities to events that could only be described as violent. The family spoke of heavy furniture moving on its own, doors slamming shut so forcefully that the entire house seemed to shake. They reported hearing loud bangs on the walls at all hours, sometimes accompanied by flickering lights that created a strobe-like terror in the darkness. The children's personalities changed as well. They became withdrawn, jumped at small noises, and dreaded being left alone even for a moment. Carmen recounted how she once saw what looked like a swirling black mass at the bottom of the stairs, roiling like a cloud of smoke but somehow filled with a deeper darkness than ordinary shadows. She said the sight froze her in place, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were telling her. Alan, too, experienced moments of sheer panic, describing nights when he felt that someone was standing over him, breathing heavily, though he could see no one when he opened his eyes. Desperate for help, the Snedekers reached out to various sources. They tried clergymen from local churches, some of whom came to the house to pray or bless each room. For a brief time, a sense of calm would follow these visits, but it never lasted. Soon, the noises and apparitions would return, often stronger than before. Carmen, feeling as though she was losing her grip on reality, spoke with a friend who suggested contacting paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were well known by then for their involvement in notorious cases like the Amityville Horror. Their reputation as demonologists and ghost hunters preceded them, and although some considered them sensationalists, others saw them as the best hope for families experiencing genuine hauntings. When Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived, they listened to the family's accounts with solemn attention. The Warrens claimed to sense an overwhelming negative energy in the house, an energy that seemed particularly concentrated in the basement. They described it as a demonic presence rather than mere restless spirits. Lorraine, who was said to be a clairvoyant, spoke of encountering a dark force that seemed to cling to the home, feeding off fear and despair. The Warrens concluded that what the Snedekers faced was not a classic ghostly haunting but a full-blown demonic infestation, one that required strong measures to combat. News of the Warrens' involvement quickly heightened interest in the house. Local media picked up the story, and within months, the Snedeker haunting became a nationally discussed paranormal case. Television crews occasionally staked out the street, hoping to catch footage of something unexplained. Producers of TV specials invited the Snedekers, as well as the Warrens, to share their experiences. The family's eyes often appeared hollow and weary in interviews, as though they had not slept in days. Carmen described hearing low growls echoing in the dead of night and seeing shadowy figures that moved with purpose, not just random illusions of light. Alan spoke more sparingly, but he, too, recounted experiences that left him convinced that something evil and intelligent lurked in the corners of their home. Their children, protected from the spotlight, nevertheless shared enough details to convey the terror they felt. As with all publicized hauntings, a wave of doubt and skepticism followed. Some observers wondered if the family had exaggerated or even fabricated parts of the story for attention or financial gain. After all, sensational hauntings sometimes led to book deals or movie rights. Others pointed out that living in a funeral home could create a psychological burden, especially under the strain of a child's illness. They argued that stress, fear, and grief could manifest as a group delusion, reinforcing each person's belief in the supernatural. Additionally, some neighbors maintained that they never saw or heard anything especially strange from the house and questioned why so many bizarre events would limit themselves to the Snedekers alone. The debate over authenticity did not change the fact that the Snedekers felt trapped by their experiences. Over time, family members reported physical attacks. Carmen claimed she woke up with bruises and scratches on her body, as if invisible claws had raked her skin while she slept. One story that circulated mentioned that a relative staying with them felt paralyzed in bed, unable to move or scream, while an unseen entity pressed down on her chest. Whether these were night terrors or paranormal assaults became a matter of personal belief. Regardless, the family's fear was palpable. At one point, they considered leaving the house altogether, but financial constraints and medical obligations complicated their decision. They also feared that whatever plagued them might follow if they moved. In the midst of this turmoil, various attempts to cleanse the home took place. Some local priests performed more structured exorcisms, walking from room to room with holy water and prayer, ordering the demonic force to depart. For days after these rituals, the house would seem quieter, the air less tense. However, Carmen later claimed that each time, the calm was short-lived. It was as if the entity withdrew temporarily, only to return with renewed fury. In interviews, the Warrens suggested that true deliverance from such a haunting might require a specialized exorcism performed by more authoritative clergy or a deeper, long-term spiritual intervention. Ed Warren stated that the negativity in the house was tied not just to the building's past, but to the emotional state of the family itself. Unless they broke the cycle of fear, he said, the force would keep feeding. Eventually, the Snedekers did move out, though accounts differ on the exact timeline and circumstances. After they left, stories emerged about the new occupants who reported no such disturbances, leading skeptics to argue that the entire haunting might have been exaggerated or invented. On the other hand, some believe the negative energy subsided once the family was gone or that the new tenants were simply less open to noticing subtle phenomena. Still others speculate that the alleged demonic presence might have latched onto the Snedekers specifically, drawn by their vulnerabilities and the emotional turmoil within the household. Years later, the tale was adapted into a film called The Haunting in Connecticut, which used the basic framework of the story. An unsuspecting family moves into a former funeral home only to face terrifying supernatural events, but took liberties with the details for dramatic effect. In the movie, one of the children is primarily the focus of the haunting, with ghostly apparitions and jump scares that highlight the building's mortuary past. While the film brought renewed attention to the Snedeker case, it also fueled fresh skepticism from people who felt Hollywood had sensationalized the story to the point of fiction. Carmen, who occasionally gave interviews, said she recognized the film's changes but maintained that the essence of their ordeal remained rooted in truth. They had faced something dark that defied rational explanation. I remember being particularly struck by an interview in which Carmen described her struggle to maintain a semblance of normalcy during the worst of the haunting. She spoke of cooking breakfast in a kitchen where utensils might suddenly shift, or of doing laundry while glimpsing fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. She described how her children, once carefree, had grown anxious and prone to nightmares that left them screaming in the middle of the night. The emotional strain was evident in her voice. Whether or not every supernatural account was accurate, the toll it took on the family was undeniable. Neighbors recalled seeing them wear the same drawn expressions each morning, as though they had fought a battle overnight. Even today, discussions of the Snedeker house revolve around core questions. Did the funeral parlor's past truly leave a dark stain that unleashed malevolent forces? Did the stress of a child's illness and the claustrophobic environment of a large family living in an unusual building create a perfect storm for collective anxiety and psychosomatic phenomena? Or was there, as the Warrens insisted, a genuine demonic infestation linked to forces we scarcely understand? Each possibility offers its own explanations, yet no single theory seems to account perfectly for the range of experiences reported by multiple witnesses over time. One theory that occasionally emerges is that the funeral home aspect was paramount, that the sorrow and mourning that once took place within those walls opened a sort of gateway, allowing negative energies or entities to seep into the physical world. Some believers in the paranormal talk about residual hauntings, where emotional events replay like a recording, and intelligent hauntings, where a conscious presence interacts with people. The Snedeker case, they argue, showed signs of both. On one hand, the family described repetitive phenomena, footsteps and voices that seemed to occur at specific times, as if reenacting old patterns. On the other hand, the violence and direct confrontations pointed to something that was aware of them and intent on causing fear. Skeptics counter that the basement's macabre environment and the child's illness could have triggered a group psychological response, especially given that the family was financially strained and living under significant pressure. They question why more thorough documentation, videos, photos, or long-term monitoring never emerged to confirm the dramatic events. They point to contradictions or changes in the family's accounts, sometimes attributing them to memory shifts or the influence of media coverage. In some retellings, the number of children in the household is unclear, or the timeline of events shifts slightly. None of these contradictions necessarily prove the entire haunting was fabricated, but they do complicate the narrative. Despite the controversies, the Snedeker story has endured, likely because it touches on primal fears we all share. Few scenarios are more unsettling than discovering that your home, the place meant to protect and nurture you, is harboring something malevolent. Add to that the grim backdrop of a funeral parlor, with its direct link to death and the unknown, and it becomes a tale almost archetypal in its horror. People read or hear about it and imagine themselves waking up in a dark house, confronted by the vestiges of others' final moments. That mental image is powerful, stirring a blend of curiosity and revulsion. Over the years, I spoke with a few paranormal enthusiasts who visited Southington in search of answers. Some simply drove past the house, noticing that it looked perfectly ordinary, with manicured lawns and neighbors going about their daily routines. Others claimed they walked near the property late at night, hoping to sense whatever might still linger. While most left without any supernatural experiences, one individual told me they heard a faint knocking sound that seemed to follow them along the sidewalk, stopping each time they paused. They couldn't confirm it was paranormal, but it added another tiny layer to the quilt of stories surrounding the house. Those who approach the case from a religious or spiritual standpoint sometimes interpret the haunting as a battle between good and evil, suggesting that the mortuary setting allowed demonic entities to anchor themselves in the living world. They cite the Warrens' involvement as evidence that a more profound spiritual malady existed, one that required more than a simple house blessing. Some faith-based communities have even used the Snedeker case as a warning about the potential dangers of dwelling in places that have seen intense sorrow or unusual activities. While that might sound extreme, it reflects an age-old belief that locations can be tainted by dark deeds or continuous exposure to death. Looking at the bigger picture, the story of the Snedeker house parallels other notorious hauntings, such as the Amityville Horror or the Enfield Poltergeist, where a family under duress moves into a seemingly normal dwelling and soon finds themselves contending with forces beyond rational understanding. In each instance, the emotional turmoil of the occupants seems to amplify the activity, creating a feedback loop of fear and manifestation. In the Snedeker's case, the child's medical condition and the associated emotional weight may have played a significant role. One can only imagine the heartbreak of caring for a sick child, trying to remain hopeful, while also being confronted by terrifying incidents that no doctor or neighbor could help with. Though the house remains standing, much quieter in recent years, the legend persists. Some versions of the story emphasize the demonic side, painting the basement as a gateway to hellish realms. Others treat it as a cautionary tale about the power of suggestion and the fragility of the human psyche when confronted with stress. There are even those who believe the entire saga was a hoax, citing a lack of hard evidence and conflicting testimonies. Yet, despite the disagreements, the Snedeker case continues to pop up in discussions of America's most infamous hauntings, partly because it challenges our comfort zone, a normal family home turned into a battleground with the unknown. I recall one poignant interview with Carmen Snedeker, given many years after they moved out. She seemed tired, as though she had told her story 100 times and knew many would not believe her. She insisted, however, that something truly evil had once inhabited that house, something that twisted their sense of safety and brought them to the brink of despair. She said she forgave those who doubted her, because unless you've lived through it, it's almost impossible to fathom. She also expressed regret for any sensationalism that might have crept into later versions of the account, especially with the movie adaptation. In her view, the reality was already terrifying enough. The child who saw the darkest visions eventually grew up and spoke sparingly about that chapter of his life. From what I understand, the experience left lingering scars, nightmares, a lingering fear of the dark, and distrust of old houses. While his health issues eventually found some stability, the emotional wounds from believing he was targeted by a malevolent force took far longer to heal. If nothing else, that alone is a tragedy that transcends debates over whether or not a demon truly prowled the basement. Some might ask why the Snedekers stayed as long as they did. This question emerges in almost every haunting case. Why not simply pack up and leave the moment objects start flying? But reality is rarely that simple. Between medical expenses, limited housing options, and the hope that some measure of prayer or intervention could resolve the problems, the family found themselves in a dilemma. They were tied to a location that was supposedly harming them, yet not in a position to walk away without risking financial ruin. This predicament resonates with many who have faced crises in life. Sometimes you endure the unimaginable simply because you see no viable alternative. Years after the events, a few journalists attempted deep-dive investigations, reviewing property records and interviewing local residents. Some uncovered small discrepancies, like whether the basement actually contained old embalming stations or if some details were fabricated. Yet these investigations never yielded a full debunking of the haunting. Instead, they left a muddled portrait, a family in crisis, an unusual house with a morbid history, and a swirl of stories that may or may not align perfectly with reality. This muddle is common in paranormal cases, where personal testimony often clashes with the demand for empirical proof. One can amass hundreds of anecdotal accounts, but without verifiable evidence, the story remains a matter of faith, perception, and memory. Ed and Lorraine Warren, for their part, stood by their assessment that the house held a demonic presence, even referencing the case in their lectures and books. Their critics accused them of over-dramatizing events, while their supporters praised them for helping a tormented family. Regardless of where one stands on the Warrens, their involvement ensured that the Snedeker haunting would not fade into local obscurity. By linking it to other high-profile hauntings, they essentially inscribed it into the annals of American paranormal lore, where it continues to prompt debate among ghost hunters, religious groups, and casual enthusiasts alike. As for me, having spent countless hours reading about the Snedeker's ordeal, talking to people who claimed second-hand knowledge, and pondering the underlying questions, I find myself in a place of cautious respect. I respect the emotional pain the family went through, whether it was caused by actual supernatural forces or an extreme psychological crisis. I respect the house's history, acknowledging that a building once used for funeral services might carry a palpable weight. And I respect the enduring mystery, how a cluster of strange events can reshape a family's life, ignite public fascination, and remain unsolved decades later. Much like the Lemp Mansion story, the Snedeker house narrative does not revolve around gore or overly aggressive spirits. Instead, it focuses on a steady, relentless sense of horror creeping into daily life, turning ordinary moments into nerve-wracking confrontations with the unknown. There is no single act of violence that defines the haunting, but rather a collection of minor and major incidents that accumulate, each one eroding the family's sense of safety. The repeated mention of cold spots, rancid smells, and fleeting apparitions underscores the notion that something intangible was always lurking, just out of sight. If you ever drive through Southington, you might pass by a row of houses that all look similar, with modest yards and neat exteriors. The Snedeker house might not stand out at first glance, which is exactly what makes these stories so unnerving. It's not some decrepit mansion on a lonely hill, but an unassuming home in a suburban neighborhood. That ordinariness forces us to accept that if the Snedeker's experiences were real, then the extraordinary can hide within the everyday. One can't help but wonder if the new residents, or even casual visitors, ever pick up on residual echoes, perhaps a chill in the air or a sense of being watched. In the end, whether you believe the Snedekers encountered a demonic force, experienced a collective psychological ordeal, or simply allowed their imaginations to run wild, their account has persisted for decades. Like all long-standing hauntings, it speaks to a deeper human fascination with death, the afterlife, and the possibility that sometimes the boundary between our world and the unknown grows perilously thin. Even reading about it can leave you with an uneasy feeling, prompting you to look over your shoulder in a quiet room or second-guess a creak in your own house late at night. I share this story in the hope that you, too, will reflect on the nature of fear and the resilience of families who find themselves in unthinkable circumstances. The Snedekers did not set out to become the subject of a supernatural legend. They merely wanted a suitable home near a hospital, a place where they could address their child's health without undue burdens. Yet fate, or circumstance, led them to a location that held a disturbing secret, culminating in a series of events that would forever shape their lives and captivate the public's imagination. Today, the case remains one of the better-known American hauntings involving a family, thanks in part to media coverage and the Warrens' involvement, as well as the many first-person accounts of those who either lived in or visited the house. Walk into any forum or discussion group dedicated to the paranormal, and mention of the Snedeker house is sure to spark heated arguments between staunch believers and unwavering skeptics. That tension, between wanting to find rational explanations and being drawn to the mystery, is what keeps stories like this alive. They remind us that not everything fits neatly into our understanding of the world, and that sometimes people face truths that cannot be easily measured or dismissed. If you ever have the chance to read more about the Snedekers or watch interviews with them, pay attention not just to the sensational claims, but to the emotional core. You might sense the weariness in Carmen's voice, the frustration in Alan's eyes, and the anxiety that clung to the children as they recounted experiences that seemed torn from a horror novel. Even if certain details became exaggerated over time, or if collective memory filled in gaps with dramatic flair, the underlying pain was real enough to mark them deeply. Like many who encounter the inexplicable, they emerged from the ordeal forever changed. If you ever have the chance to read more about the Snedekers or watch interviews with them, pay attention not just to the sensational claims, but to the emotional core. You might sense the weariness in Carmen's voice, the frustration in Alan's eyes, and the anxiety that clung to the children as they recounted experiences that seemed torn from a horror novel. Even if certain details became exaggerated over time, or if collective memory filled in gaps with dramatic flair, the underlying pain was real enough to mark them deeply. Like many who encounter the inexplicable, they emerged from the ordeal forever changed. And so this single home in Salvington, once just a mortuary, stands as a testament to the enduring power of stories that mingle the ordinary with the supernatural. For some, it remains a prime example of a genuine haunting, proof that negative energies or demonic entities can indeed latch onto a location steeped in sorrow. For others, it is a lesson in how stress, illness, and suggestion can combine to produce real terror, even if it exists solely in the human mind. Regardless of the lens through which one views it, the Snedeker house haunting has left an indelible imprint on American ghost lore, reminding us that the line between what we know and what we fear is often a fragile one. In reading this account, I invite you to hold on to your own sense of wonder. Perhaps you will feel a sympathetic chill, imagining the footsteps in the dark, or the faint voices echoing in a basement that once housed the dead. Or maybe you will look for logical flaws, mentally scrutinizing each claim for holes in the story. Either way, the haunting has done what hauntings do best, challenged our assumptions about what is possible and asked us to confront the mysteries that dwell at the edges of our comprehension. And whether or not you come away believing in demonic infestations, you will have glimpsed the profound impact that fear and faith can have on a family caught in the uncertain space between the known and the unknown. May this story, told in the simplest way I know, serve as a reminder that even the most mundane-looking places can harbor layers of history we cannot fully grasp. The Snedeker house was not imposing or grand. It did not loom on a hill with thunderclouds swirling overhead. It was just a house on a street, a house intended to be a refuge for a struggling family. Yet within its walls, they reported living nightmares they could hardly explain. That dissonance, the gap between ordinary appearances and extraordinary events, fuels the haunting's power. In that gap, we find both our darkest fears and our deepest curiosities, united in one unsettling question: What if our world holds corners where past tragedies and hidden forces converge to create a reality far stranger than we dare admit? And so we end this journey through the Snedeker house haunting, a story of everyday people facing unimaginable horrors, of a funeral parlor's echoes that supposedly refuse to rest, and of a family pushed to the edge by forces they could not see or control. Wherever you stand on its authenticity, let it stand as a testament to the potent mix of sorrow, mystery, and human courage that can arise when the realm of the dead seems to intersect with that of the living. For in the stillness of any old home, in the hush of midnight, we might hear the faintest whisper of voices gone by, and in that whisper lies an invitation to consider that perhaps our world is broader and more haunted than we often allow ourselves to believe.